The rain had started before Clara Bennett's taxi reached the Vale Imperial, and by the time the driver pulled beneath the brass awning, London looked less like a city and more like a watercolor someone had dragged a wet hand across. Streetlights dissolved into gold streaks. Headlights blurred. The pavement shone like black glass. Clara stepped out with one overnight case, one canvas tote, and the expression of a woman who had been awake for too long to be impressed by luxury. The Vale Imperial was one of those famous hotels people spoke about as if it were a government institution or a cathedral. It had hosted prime ministers, film stars, royal relatives, and the sort of billionaires who preferred not to be photographed unless they controlled the angle. Tonight it smelled of polished cedar, white lilies, and money. Clara barely noticed. She had spent the whole ride from Paddington trying not to think about the final notice folded inside her tote, the one stamped red and addressed to the Lantern House, the small seaside her late mother had loved and her younger brother Theo had begged her not to let die. She checked in at the marble desk, accepted the key card the receptionist slid toward her with a smile that looked expensive enough to belong to the furniture, and made her way to the private executive floor. Her interview for a consulting role at Vale Hospitality was scheduled for the next morning. All she wanted now was a hot shower, silence, and maybe 10 uninterrupted minutes before anxiety found her again. The corridor on the 37th floor was hushed and dimly lit, thick carpet swallowing the sound of her steps. Room 3708 stood at the end of the hall. Clara pressed the key card to the lock. The light flashed green. She exhaled, pushed the door open, and took 3 steps inside before she realized the room was occupied. A man stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back half-turned, jacket discarded, tie loosened, one hand around a crystal glass and the other braced against the glass as rain traveled down the city beyond him. He was tall in the way that made the room rearrange itself around him, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and very clearly not a harmless stranger. There was nothing casual about him, even with his collar open. He turned at the sound of the door, and whatever apology Clara had intended died at once. His face belonged on the cover of financial magazines that described men as formidable and visionary when what they usually meant was rich enough to scare other rich men. His gaze landed on her, then on her suitcase, then back on her face, cold and direct and cutting enough to make most people retreat. Clara was too tired to be most people. "Either this hotel has a very unusual welcome package," she said, lifting the key card between 2 fingers, "or your staff have handed me the wrong room." For 1 second he simply stared at her. Then his eyes dropped to the card. "This is my suite." "Wonderful. Then one of us has been catastrophically inconvenienced, and I'm guessing you'd like it to be me." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement. More surprise that she had not started apologizing in triplicate. He set his glass down on a side table and crossed the room. Up close he was even more dangerous looking, not because he moved quickly but because he moved like a man accustomed to being obeyed without repeating himself. "You opened the door," he said. The lock turned green. "I assumed I wasn't breaking into the penthouse of an extremely hostile duke." "I'm not a duke." "No. Dukes are decorative." "You look employable." His gaze sharpened, and for the first time Clara got the strange impression that she had interrupted not an evening but a war being fought in silence. A laptop lay open on the dining table beside a stack of briefing folders, 3 marked confidential. The television was on mute, showing a business channel with a headline ticker beneath a photo of the man standing in front of her. Adrian Vale, Chief Executive Officer of Vale Hospitality Group. The very man whose company she had crossed the country to interview within 10 hours. The very man every trade article described as brilliant, brutal, and impossible to read. Clara closed her eyes for one short, private second. "Of course you are. You know me. I know the face attached to the corporation currently deciding whether independent boutique properties are worth preserving or gutting for luxury conversions." That earned her his full attention. "You have opinions." "I have a family business on life support because men in tailored coats call places home until a spreadsheet tells them otherwise. A knock sounded before he could answer. The door opened almost immediately and a pale, breathless duty manager appeared, followed by the same receptionist from downstairs, now looking as though she wanted the carpet to swallow her whole. Apologies poured into the room in a flood. A software sync failure. An executive reassignment. An unforgivable error. Clara listened while Adrian said very little, which turned out to be worse than shouting. His silence had edges. By the time the manager finished, the air in the suite felt thin. Then Adrian looked at Clara again. What room was she meant to have? 3412, sir. Give her the suite next to mine instead. The manager blinked. Sir. The one adjoining. If your systems fail again, I'd rather know where the damage is coming from. Clara folded her arms. How generous. His eyes held hers. Stay. The manager went still. So did the receptionist. Clara let out a quiet laugh because what else was there to do when the most intimidating hotel magnate in Britain looked at you like a challenge and asked you to remain standing in his misallocated penthouse. I beg your pardon. I heard you downstairs. He glanced at the toad over her shoulder. You're here for tomorrow's consultant interview. She stiffened. That is none of your business. It became my business when you walked into my suite and insulted my industry within 30 seconds. And yet you're still talking to me. I'm interested in people who say the dangerous thing first. Rain beat harder against the glass behind him. Somewhere below them the city went on glittering and indifferent. Clara should have left. She knew that. She should have collected the corrected key card, gone to bed, and spent the night rehearsing polite, strategic answers for the morning. Instead she said, if this is where you tell me I've blown my chances, at least do me the courtesy of being quick. You haven't blown them. His voice lowered. I'm about to make you a proposal. Clara stared at him as the hotel staff vanished with the speed of people fleeing an active explosion. The adjoining suite key card was placed in her hand. The door clicked shut. Suddenly it was only her and Adrian Vale and the rain, which seemed to press closer to the windows as if the weather had also decided this was more interesting than anything else happening in London tonight. She did not sit when he gestured toward the armchair near the fire. She remained standing beside her suitcase, damp at the hem, exhausted, annoyed, and very aware that men like Adrian usually did not make proposals to women like her unless the word proposal meant inconvenience in expensive packaging. Start with the part where I say no, she told him. It will save us both time. He leaned one shoulder against the edge of the dining table, studying her with a coolness that would have been easier to endure if it did not seem so deliberate. Tomorrow morning my company hosts the board of the Harrington Legacy Trust. The trust that controls 14% of your voting shares. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You did your homework. I had an interview. You had more than that. You've read the takeover filings, the regional asset reports, and the guest retention complaints from our coastal properties. Clara said nothing. There was no point pretending. She had spent the last 6 months tracking every article about Vale Hospitality because Vale had quietly acquired the debt-holding company now threatening the Lantern House. She knew how close the Little Inn was to being absorbed, branded, and stripped of every imperfect thing that made it alive. The trust does not like me, Adrian said. That hardly makes you unique. His mouth almost curved again. They think I'm efficient enough to grow the company and cold enough to hollow it out while smiling for the annual report. Tonight was supposed to solve that. He glanced toward the muted television, where an entertainment anchor was now smiling beneath a photograph of Adrian beside a statuesque woman in silver silk. The headline read Socialite calls OFF wedding to hotel tycoon. Clara looked back at him slowly. Ah. My fiancée, he said flatly, or rather the woman who agreed to become my fiancée in exchange for a merger of family interests, decided 2 hours ago to announce to the press that she prefers a man with less discipline and more hair. Clara could not help it. A small sound escaped her, halfway between sympathy and laughter. Please tell me you did not say that to the media. Not yet. And now the trust arrives tomorrow expecting evidence that you are a stable, family-minded steward of a legacy brand instead of a machine in a suit. Yes. And your brilliant solution is to ask the woman who accidentally invaded your room to fix your image before breakfast. Not my image. His gaze sharpened. My problem. She laughed outright at that, tired enough to be honest. You are a problem. So I've been told. He pushed a folder across the table toward her. I want you to review the guest experience proposal I'm presenting tomorrow. If you can improve it tonight, you get the consulting contract immediately. Clara did not reach for the folder. That sounds like work. You said proposal. There's more. His tone remained maddeningly even. The trust chairwoman is 82 years old, ruthless, difficult to impress, and convinced that every corporation reveals itself by how it treats the people closest to power. She was prepared to observe me with my fiancé over the next 6 weeks before the final vote. Clara felt the answer arriving before he said it, and hated that he could probably see the exact moment she understood. No. You haven't heard the terms. I do not need the terms. The answer is no. You would be compensated. I said no. He did not move. 500,000 pounds. Silence followed. Thick, complete, shocking silence. Clara's fingers tightened around the key card until the plastic edges bit into her palm. 500,000 pounds would clear the debt on the lantern house, pay Theo's supplier invoices, repair the seawall damage from the winter storms, and leave enough to replace the roof that had begun leaking in the upstairs corridor last February. 500,000 pounds was not money. It was oxygen. She hated that he knew it. That is an offensive amount of leverage, she said quietly. It is an accurate assessment of what your refusal costs you. She took one slow breath. You looked me up. I had your application pulled after the front desk told me your name. And that was enough to justify financial excavation. No, his voice dipped. But you said something true about what companies call home before spreadsheets erase it. Most people in this building speak at me. You spoke from somewhere else. The folder waited between them. She glanced at the first page. Guest retention figures. Independent property reviews. A pilot preservation model for coastal heritage hotels. Her pulse skipped. This is based on the Lantern House. It is based on 12 properties, one of which is yours. You have no right. I have every legal right, he said, then paused, and when he spoke again his tone changed, losing a layer of steel. That does not mean I'm right. The room went very still. It would have been easier if he had stayed cruel. Easier if he had remained only the man from the headlines, carved from glass and profit. But that brief, precise correction, admission without softness, honesty without excuse, slid beneath her defenses in a way she did not appreciate. What exactly are you asking me to do, she said. For 6 weeks, you will act as my fiancé in public. In private, you will work directly with me on the heritage preservation strategy and the trust vote. You will challenge what deserves challenging. You will attend the necessary events. At the end of 6 weeks, the contract ends, the payment transfers, and your in is free. And if the tabloids decide to chew me to pieces, I'll handle them. And if your board objects, I own enough not to care. And if I decide halfway through that I hate you, his expression barely changed. Then you'll be in excellent company. She should have walked away. Instead she crossed to the windows and looked out at the rain-blurred city, thinking of peeling paint at the inn, Theo pretending not to panic, her mother once saying that places remembered the people who fought for them. 6 weeks. Just 6 weeks standing next to a man she had already decided was intolerable. When she turned back, Adrian was watching her not like a predator, not like a strategist, but like a man who had already learned how rarely desperation and dignity appeared in the same room. I want terms in writing, Clara said. No touching unless required in public and agreed in advance. No lies about my family. No decisions about the Lantern House without my direct involvement. And if you speak to me like I'm one more asset on a balance sheet, I leave. Something dark and unreadable passed through his eyes. Then he nodded once. Done. She looked at him for a long moment. This is a terrible idea. Yes, Adrian said. Clara extended her hand anyway. He took it, and the first thing she noticed was not the strength of his grip but the restraint in it, as if he was used to holding the whole world far too tightly and had made a private decision, just for 1 second, not to do the same to her. Clara slept badly, which was Adrian's fault even when he was not in the room. She woke before dawn in the adjoining suite to a tray left outside her door, coffee exactly the way she had requested downstairs without realizing anyone important was listening, toasted sourdough, poached eggs, and a small bowl of orange segment sprinkled with sea salt. There was no note. There did not need to be one. The gesture irritated her on principle because it was strategic, efficient, and unreasonably considerate. By 7:30 she was dressed in a navy sheath dress and low heels, her hair pinned up with the ruthless neatness of someone trying to look as composed as she did not feel. The folder Adrian had given her now wore 3 pages of edits in red ink, several margin notes, and one rewritten opening paragraph that replaced corporate language with something resembling humanity. When she entered his suite, he was already in a charcoal suit, tie perfectly knotted, reading her notes with the focus of a man examining live ammunition. You cut the phrase curated coastal repositioning, he said without looking up. It sounds like something said by a person who has never loved a building. He turned a page. And replaced it with preserving local memory through hospitality. Because that's what people pay for when they return to certain places. Not linen counts. Memory. His gaze lifted at last. Sit. I'm not your employee. No. You're my fiancé. Heat rose to Clara's face before she could stop it. He seemed to notice, which annoyed her further. She sat anyway at the dining table while his assistant arrived with schedules, revised press notes, and a jeweler's black box that Adrian opened without ceremony. Inside lay a diamond ring so elegant it felt almost austere, a single oval stone on a platinum band. Clara looked up sharply. Absolutely not. It needs to look convincing. It does not need to look matrimonial enough to blind satellites. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Naomi, failed to hide a smile. Adrian took the ring out and crossed the room. Clara instinctively stepped back. He stopped at once. May I? He asked. The question startled her more than the ring. After the way he dominated every room, that brief courtesy landed with disproportionate force. Clara held out her left hand. Adrian slid the ring onto her finger with maddening precision. It fit perfectly. That is not reassuring, she murmured. Naomi finally laughed. He had your size estimated from the application photo. Clara shot Adrian a look. That is either impressive or criminal. Both, occasionally. The trust meeting began at 9 in the Rosewood Salon, a room designed to make wealth look tasteful by surrounding it with antique mirrors and impossible flowers. Clara entered on Adrian's arm, aware of every eye that turned toward them and every headline currently writing itself in the heads of strangers. The trust chairwoman, Beatrice Harrington, sat at the center of the long table in pearl gray silk, thin and elegant and unmistakably predatory. Her gaze moved from Adrian to Clara to the ring, then returned to Adrian with cool interest. So, Beatrice said. You replaced one blonde heiress with a brunette who looks less decorative and considerably more dangerous. Clara smiled. That may be the nicest thing anyone says about me all week. For the first time, Beatrice looked pleased. The meeting should have belonged to Adrian, but by the second quarter hour it became clear he had invited Clara for more than appearances. He asked for her view on guest experience retention. He let her challenge a proposed renovation language pack that reduced heritage hotels to premium nostalgia assets. He did not interrupt when she described why local staff continuity mattered more than branded uniformity in smaller properties. Once, when a trustee called her sentiment naive economics, Adrian said in the same quiet tone he had used with the panicking duty manager the night before, "If you intend to insult my fiancé, do it with data." Silence followed. Beatrice's eyes sharpened. Clara refused to look at Adrian because she was too busy processing the fact that he had defended her not theatrically but instantly, like instinct. By noon the trust had agreed to extend review rather than force immediate restructuring. It was not victory, but it was breathing room, and breathing room was more valuable than most people understood. When the meeting ended, reporters waited in the lobby. Flashbulbs burst. Questions flew. How long had they been engaged? Was the wedding back on? Was Miss Bennet from the industry? Adrian placed one hand at the small of Clara's back, steady and warm through the fabric of her dress, and answered with measured ease. Clara is not a rebound. She is the most intelligent person in any room she enters, including this one. The rest is private. That line would be everywhere within the hour. Clara knew it before he finished speaking. She should have been furious. Instead, something treacherous inside her noticed the way he angled his body fractionally between her and the cameras, blocking the worst of the shove, as if the line between performance and protection had blurred when she was not watching. The rest of the day unspooled into arrangements. Naomi delivered contracts to sign, separate clauses for the consulting role and the engagement agreement. Adrian took Clara to lunch in a private dining room and spent half of it ignoring his own food while asking questions about the lantern house that did not sound like Extraction. He wanted to know who painted the rooms, why the breakfast china never matched, why guests came back. Clara told him about the widow from York who returned every spring because her late husband had proposed on the cliff path behind the inn. She told him about Theo making cinnamon rolls at 5 in the morning. She told him about storm shutters older than anyone alive to remember hanging them. Adrian listened with an attention so complete it felt dangerous. By the time evening approached, exhaustion had settled into her bones. Naomi appeared with garment bags for the charity dinner that night and informed Clara, without a flicker of apology, that the fiancé of Adrian Vale could not repeat a daytime dress at a photographed event. "I own one pair of heels that deserve civil rights," Clara said. "Excellent," Naomi replied. "We have improved the situation." The gown waiting in her room was midnight blue, simple from the front and devastating at the back. Clara stared at it while rain tapped the windows in a softer rhythm than the night before. She had agreed to 6 weeks. One day had barely passed, and already the arrangement was beginning to feel like a story being written around her faster than she could revise it. Down the hall, Adrian waited in black tie. When she stepped out of her suite, his eyes lifted from the message in his hand and stayed on her for a beat too long. It was not dramatic. It was worse. It was controlled. Appreciative. Silent in a way that turned the corridor between them into something charged and private and unmistakably not fake. "You're staring," Clara said. He came toward her slowly. "I'm adjusting to the fact that every room changes when you enter it." Her breath caught, and because she did not trust herself with that sentence, she said the only safe thing available. "For 6 weeks, she reminded him. Adrian looked at her hand where the ring caught the light, then back at her face. "For 6 weeks, he agreed, as if the words cost him more than they should have. The charity dinner took place in the Winter Garden Ballroom, a glass-roofed masterpiece of light and engineered elegance where every table glowed with candles and every guest seemed to have practiced appearing effortless in mirrors. Clara had spent enough of her life outside rooms like this to recognize the choreography at once. Wealth had its own body language. Men here shook hands as though closing invisible deals. Women laughed without showing fatigue. No one mentioned power directly because that would have been vulgar. They wore it instead, in watches, diamonds, tailored cuffs, and the confidence of people who had never wondered whether a bank would extend them one more month. Adrian moved through the room as if built for it, offering exactly the right amount of charm without ever giving away himself. Clara remained at his side, aware of the cameras, the trustees, the board members, and the curious socialites who had already decided to invent her biography before dessert. She expected Adrian to perform affection in gestures practiced enough to be forgettable. Instead he did the opposite. He kept it minimal. A hand at her waist when the crowd pressed too close. A slight lean toward her when someone asked a question. A quiet check at her elbow when her heel caught on the edge of the dance floor. None of it read as spectacle. All of it read as habit. That, Clara realized, was why people believed them. "You look alarmed," he murmured as they paused near a column wrapped in white orchids. "I'm trying to decide whether you're dangerously good at this or whether I'm more susceptible to expensive lighting than I'd like to admit. Try the champagne. It may help." "Is that a medical recommendation?" "It's a survival strategy." She almost smiled. Almost. Then a woman in silver entered the space beside Adrian like a blade sliding from velvet. She was beautiful in the polished, exacting way of people who knew the effect of their own face and maintained it like a weapon. Her blonde hair was swept into an immaculate knot. Her smile was cool enough to frost glass. "Adrian," she said. "You do move quickly." Clara felt the subtle shift in him before she saw it. His shoulders remained relaxed, but something in his expression shuddered. Celeste. So this was Celeste Harrow, board member, investor daughter, and according to the articles Clara had read, one of the sharpest expansion strategists in the company. The woman was also rumored to have expected Adrian's former engagement to end in an alliance that favored her own faction. Which meant she had every reason to hate the existence of Clara Bennett. Celeste looked Clara over with perfect manners and no warmth. "You must be the surprise." Clara lifted her glass. "I've been called worse." "I'm sure." Celeste's gaze dropped to the ring. "You'll find this world demanding." "So I've noticed. People talk. Then they should pace themselves. It's a long season." For one split second Celeste's smile tightened. Adrian, who had remained silent, said mildly, "Clara has a talent for endurance." The evening continued, but from then on Clara felt Celeste at the edges of it, appearing in conversations with trustees, leaning close to board members, smiling toward Adrian with the composure of someone who had long assumed she understood the map and did not appreciate new terrain. Clara should not have cared. Celeste was simply another elegant threat in a building full of them. Yet when Adrian disappeared for 10 minutes to take a call and returned to find Clara cornered by 3 women speculating about wedding dates, the first thing he asked was, "Who's bothering you?" "No one," Clara lied. He glanced once over her shoulder, saw Celeste halfway across the room watching them, and his expression cooled by several degrees. After dinner came dancing. Clara had expected Adrian to avoid it. Instead he held out his hand. "We need one photograph on the floor," he said. "Of course we do." She placed her hand in his. His other hand settled lightly at her waist as the orchestra slid into something slow and old-fashioned and entirely too intimate for a transaction. He guided rather than led, which surprised her. For such a controlled man, he danced as if listening rather than directing. Clara became acutely aware of the heat of his palm through the fabric at her back, the clean scent of vetiver and starch at his collar, the way every camera in the room slowly ceased to matter. "You've done this before," she said. "Dance? Pretend." His gaze came down to hers. "Not like this." The answer landed too softly to be performance. She felt it in the space beneath her ribs, inconvenient and immediate. "Careful," she murmured. "You're beginning to sound sincere." That would be reckless. By the time the song ended, Clara had forgotten 3 separate reasons she disliked him. Then she turned and saw Celeste speaking to a man from the financial press while glancing toward them, and memory returned like cold water. Later, after the trustees departed and the ballroom thinned, Adrian brought Clara to a quiet terrace overlooking the river. The city stretched below in silver and black. He loosened his tie slightly, the first visible crack in his composure all evening. "You were excellent today," he said. I insulted a trustee before lunch. You made her think. She values that more. Clara leaned on the stone balustrade. Your company has spent years teaching itself to talk about place without meaning it. Yes. You say yes to criticism with alarming ease. I'm not afraid of being wrong. He paused. I'm afraid of discovering it too late. She turned her head toward him then, truly toward him, and found him already looking at her. The distance between them did something strange. It felt measured and fragile at once, as if either of them could ruin it by moving too soon. Why me? Clara asked quietly. Not the arrangement. Me. The breeze off the river stirred a strand of hair loose from her pinned-up style. Adrian reached out, then stopped short of touching it. His hand fell back to his side. Because you walked into the wrong room, he said, and instead of being intimidated, you told me exactly what kind of man you thought I was. That is not usually how one wins favor. No, his voice lowered. It is how one becomes unforgettable. Before Clara could answer, Naomi appeared at the terrace doors with the tactful expression of someone paid to interrupt disaster just before it turned irreversible. Your car is ready, she said. The moment broke, but not completely. Adrian nodded once and stepped back, yet Clara carried the feeling of it all the way to the lift, all the way upstairs, all the way into the quiet of her suite. She should have slept immediately. Instead she stood at the window with her earring still on and watched the lights of London shimmer in the wet dark. At midnight someone knocked. Clara opened the door to find no one there, only a folded note resting on a tray with tea and a plate of still warm shortbread. You looked tired after dinner. Eat something. Tomorrow begins at 7. No signature. No flourish. No attempt at charm. Clara stared at the note for a long time before stepping back inside and closing the door with more care than necessary. The first week developed a rhythm neither of them admitted to noticing. Mornings began with meetings, site reports, and trust reviews. Afternoons belonged to property visits, where Clara discovered that Adrian did not merely own hotels, he carried their occupancy rates, staffing concerns, supplier delays, and renovation schedules somewhere in that frighteningly precise mind of his. Even more unsettling was the fact that he listened when she disagreed with him. Not performatively. Not with that corporate trick of nodding while waiting to resume one's own opinion. He listened as though argument, when earned, improved the architecture of things. They flew to Whitby on Tuesday to inspect a failing clifftop property slated for luxury redevelopment. Clara spent most of the journey braced for the moment Adrian would reveal himself as exactly the man she had expected, the sort who looked at old wood and patched roofs and saw only margins. Instead he spent 40 minutes talking to a housekeeper about the local wedding season and another 20 asking the elderly night porter how guests described the sea when they first opened the curtains. Clara watched this with suspicion so strong it almost qualified as moral outrage. You are impossible to categorize, she told him afterward as they stood on the empty terrace overlooking a furious grey coast. He buttoned his coat against the wind. Perhaps the categories are lazy. That sounds like something a man says when he benefits from being misread. A gull cried somewhere above them. Adrian turned his face toward the sea before answering. I benefit from being underestimated emotionally. I pay heavily for being misunderstood strategically. It was the closest thing to self-disclosure he had offered, and it lodged under her skin all day. That evening, back at the hotel, Clara found a package in her suite, a pair of waterproof boots in her size and a note from Naomi that read, for tomorrow's site walk. The cliffs are less forgiving than Mr. Vale pretends to be. Clara marched down the adjoining corridor and knocked on Adrian's door hard enough to satisfy principle. He opened it wearing shirt sleeves, no tie, and reading glasses low on his nose, which was frankly unfair because no man built like a threat should also look scholarly in private. You sent boots, she said. You needed boots. I own boots. You own city boots. Those cliffs were an insurance claim waiting to happen. You are not allowed to solve problems before I complain about them. He leaned against the doorframe. I'll inform operations. She should have walked away. Instead she noticed the open files behind him, the lamplit table, the half-finished dinner he had clearly ignored, and the pinch of fatigue at the corner of his eyes. Have you eaten? Yes. That plate says otherwise. Are you auditing me now? Apparently. She folded her arms. Finish your dinner. To her great annoyance, he looked amused. You realize you are in no position to give orders. Then think of it as peer review. He studied her for one long beat, then stepped aside. Come in. She crossed the threshold with caution, still not fully accustomed to the intimate wrongness of being in his private space. He returned to the table and sat. Clara remained standing until he picked up his fork, at which point she muttered, "Good," and turned to leave. Clara. She paused. Thank you. The words were simple. Yet from Adrian they carried the weight of something rarely offered and never wasted. She nodded once and went back to her suite with her pulse behaving in a manner she resented. On Thursday the tabloids ran photographs of them exiting the Whitby property in matching dark coats, her laughing at something he had said, his hand steady at her back on the windy steps. The headline declared Hotel King softens for mystery fiancé. Theo called within minutes. Tell me you're blackmailing him, he said without preamble. Clara dropped onto the sofa and covered her eyes with one hand. I'm under strict instructions not to discuss the arrangement. So there is an arrangement. There is a temporary professional entanglement. Theo made a sound halfway between horror and delight. Oh, this is catastrophic. Mum would have loved it. At the mention of their mother, Clara's chest tightened and softened at once. She would have told me not to trust men who own cufflinks more expensive than roof repairs. She also would have liked that you're fighting for the inn. That part was true. It was why Clara endured the cameras, the schedules, the ring on her finger that felt heavier in quiet moments than any jewel should. Every day she stayed, the lantern house inched closer to safety. Every day she left would mean returning to final notices and impossible sums. On Friday night Vale Imperial hosted a private investor reception. Clara expected champagne politics and endured them. What she did not expect was Lucas Mercer, a venture architect from Adrian's expansion team, warm-eyed and charming, who spent 10 minutes telling Clara she looked like she belonged anywhere she pleased and another 10 asking if she had considered staying in London after the contract ended. Adrian appeared at her side before she could answer. Lucas, he said. There were only 2 syllables in the name, yet somehow they sounded like a border closing. Lucas smiled. We were discussing coastal redevelopment. Were you? Clara glanced between them. I am capable of discussing buildings without a chaperone. Undoubtedly, Adrian said. The trustees are asking for us. He did not offer his arm. He simply waited. Clara should have stayed where she was out of defiance. Instead she found herself moving with him through the crowd, annoyed by the sharp, private satisfaction that settled in her chest at his interruption. You were rude, she said once they reached the corridor. He wants to recruit you. So I dislike people who treat talent like sport. That sounded dangerously personal. He stopped walking. I don't enjoy watching other men assume access they haven't earned. The hallway seemed to narrow around them. Clara held his gaze, aware of the chandelier light above and the distant noise of the reception fading into irrelevance. This is becoming complicated, she said. Adrian's expression did not change, but his voice dropped. It was complicated the moment you opened the wrong door. Complicated became impossible 3 nights later in Edinburgh, where the trust tour took them next. The Caledon House was one of Vale Hospitality's oldest properties, all carved stone, velvet corridors, and fireplaces large enough to humble reason. A storm rolled over the city before dinner and trapped half the guests indoors, leaving the hotel wrapped in rain and old amber light. Clara spent the afternoon reviewing event figures with Adrian in the library, where dark wood shelves rose 2 stories high and the air smelled of leather, paper, and smoke from the banked fire. At 6, the power flickered. At 6:01 it failed completely. The backup generators restored emergency lighting, but not before the room dropped into a deep, intimate dark that seemed to erase everything except breathing and the brief scrape of Clara's chair. She stood too quickly, catching her ankle on the rug's edge. "Careful," Adrian said, and then he was there, one hand around her elbow, the other braced at her waist as she steadied. The emergency lights came on in muted gold. They were standing too close. Not the public sort of close that cameras devoured. The private sort. The sort measured in shared air. "I'm fine," Clara said, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. "I know." He did not let go immediately. The storm rattled the windows. The rest of the hotel seemed far away, reduced to distant footsteps and muffled staff instructions. Clara became acutely aware of his hand at her waist, of the heat of it even through fabric, of the impossible stillness that overtook him whenever he was 1 second from doing something he had decided he should not do. "Adrian." "Yes. That is not your professional voice. Nothing about this room feels professional." The honesty of it stunned them both. Clara took half a step back, and his hand fell away at once. Not reluctance. Restraint. It might have been easier if he had closed the distance against her wishes. Easier to hate him then. Harder was this constant, infuriating choice he kept making to stop just before the line and force her to notice it had been his to cross. They worked through dinner because the storm grounded flights and postponed the next morning's trustee departure. Naomi sent food to the library, roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, soup, bread still hot enough to steam when torn open. Clara recognized the pattern and narrowed her eyes. "You ordered before anyone asked what I wanted. You skipped lunch. That is not an answer. You become impatient when hungry. I become impatient when managed." He poured her soup anyway. "Then eat before you become eloquent." She should not have laughed. She did, and something in his face changed at the sound of it, softening in a way so brief she almost doubted it had happened. Later, while Adrian stepped out to take a call, Clara noticed a folder left partly open near the end of the table. She did not mean to pry. Her eyes simply fell on a familiar name typed in bold, The Lantern House. Beneath it was a preservation budget, approved in principle pending final vote, along with handwritten notes in Adrian's sharp script. Retain original dining room beams. Keep local baker contract. No franchise signage on exterior. Seasonal staff housing to be renovated, not replaced. Her throat tightened. He had already done the work. Not because the contract demanded it. Not because the trust was watching. The notes were dated 3 days before he made his offer. Before she had agreed to stand beside him. Before he had any reason to believe she would stay. When he returned, she was still holding the folder. "You approved these changes." His gaze flicked to the papers, then back to her face. "I asked for them." "Before me?" "Yes." "Why?" He set his phone down slowly. "Because I visited your inn in February." Clara stared. "What?" "You were in Brighton handling your mother's probate hearing. Theo was there. He didn't know who I was. He walked me through the storm damage and explained why the place mattered." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, as if he disliked what came next. "I told finance to hold conversion until I'd reviewed it myself. Then the trust vote accelerated. Then the debt pressure increased. Then you walked into my room." For one suspended second she could not find language large enough for the collision inside her. Anger, relief, gratitude, distrust, hope. He had gone there. He had seen the inn before he knew her. He had made room for its survival before she became useful to him. "You could have told me. You already believed I was dangerous." I preferred evidence to persuasion. That is a very arrogant answer. It is also true. The storm struck the windows again. Clara set the folder down with too much care because her hands were no longer entirely steady. You make it difficult to keep disliking you. He stepped closer, so slowly she could have stopped him at any point. Do you want to keep trying? The question went through her like heat. Clara looked up. His expression had lost all polish now. No boardroom composure. No curated detachment. Only a man standing close enough to kiss her and disciplined enough to ask first with his eyes. She should have said something clever. Something defensive. Instead she said, very softly, I don't know what I want. His voice when it came was rougher than she had ever heard it. That makes two of us. He reached up then, not for her mouth, not for the easy drama of desire, but to touch the loose strand of hair at her temple and tuck it behind her ear. The gentleness of it was worse than hunger. It told her too much. A knock shattered the moment. Naomi's voice carried through the door. Sorry to interrupt. The trustees have moved breakfast to 8. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, as if civilization itself had committed a personal offense. Clara stepped back first. She needed air, distance, a locked door between them and the storm and the impossible tenderness of that almost touch. At her suite, she found another note waiting with tea. For the record, I disliked the rain before you began looking at it like that. She sat on the edge of the bed with the note in her lap and knew, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that the arrangement had crossed into dangerous territory long before either of them said so aloud. By the start of the third week, London had decided to be bright again. The rain lifted, the heat came unexpectedly, and the city began to gleam under a summer sky so clear it made people forgive things they should not. Clara did not forgive herself for the way she now noticed Adrian in fragments. The line of his forearm when he rolled back a cuff to review plans. The quiet shift in his voice when speaking to elderly staff. The fact that he never interrupted her when she spoke about buildings but always interrupted anyone who dismissed her for being too young. Attraction was one problem. Admiration was worse. The next major trust event took place at the Vale family estate in Hampshire, a long weekend framed publicly as an engagement celebration and privately as an inspection. Beatrice Harrington had insisted on observing them outside corporate territory. Adrian seemed unsurprised by this, which made Clara suspect his life had always involved a rotating cast of powerful elders testing whether he was human enough to deserve what he controlled. The estate itself was absurdly beautiful, all honey-colored stone and formal gardens rolling into lavender fields. Clara hated it on sight. Houses like this made her think of inheritance and polished cruelty, of rooms where people had learned to wound one another with teaspoons and posture. Adrian noticed her expression as the car pulled up. You look as if you're arriving for trial. I assume that's because I am. Possibly, he said. My family is less forgiving than the board. The warning proved accurate within 10 minutes. Adrian's aunt asked Clara whether she had always intended to marry so advantageously. A cousin wanted to know if boutique innkeeping counted as real hospitality or sentimental bedmaking. An elderly uncle referred to the lantern house as quaint, which in his mouth sounded perilously close to useless. Clara handled each question with steady courtesy sharpened just enough to draw a line. Adrian said little, but each time she was cornered he appeared near enough to shift the pressure away. Only one member of the family surprised her. Adrian's grandmother, Evelyn Vale, small and elegantly severe in cream linen, summoned Clara to the conservatory after luncheon. Clara entered prepared to be measured and dismissed. Instead Evelyn poured tea with perfect hands and said, My grandson was impossible at 12, intolerable at 20, and merely alarming at 30. Since meeting you, he has begun pausing before answering. I'd like to thank you. Clara almost choked on her tea. I am not sure I deserve credit for any neurological event in Adrian Vale. Evelyn's mouth twitched. Nonsense. Men like him are built of habits and consequence. Disruption is rare. Then I should apologize. You should stay. Evelyn held Clara's gaze over the rim of her cup. Not because this is convenient. Because he has spent most of his life being useful, admired, and obeyed. Those conditions produce very lonely men. The words settled somewhere deep, somewhere Clara did not want them. That night there was a garden party beneath strings of lights and old trees. Music drifted over the lawns. Laughter moved between clusters of guests. Clara wore pale green silk and the ring that was beginning to feel dangerous on principle. She endured the first hour with disciplined grace, then excused herself to the edge of the terrace for air. Lucas Mercer appeared beside her carrying 2 glasses of champagne and enough charm to qualify as a tactical maneuver. "I come in peace," he said. That is what charming men always say before becoming administrative difficulties. He laughed and handed her a glass. "You look happier than the headlines imply. You think headlines are interested in happiness?" "No. But I am." He was kind, Clara thought. Genuinely so. The sort of man who made the world feel easier to stand in. They spoke for several minutes about coastal towns, architecture, and why old hotels smelled different after rain. Lucas leaned closer to hear her over the music. Clara did not notice Adrian until the conversation around them shifted, the way crowds do when a significant temperature change arrives in human form. Adrian stopped beside them, black suit, open collar, expression unreadable. Lucas. There it was again, that dangerous economy of tone. Lucas smiled, to his credit unbothered. "I was borrowing your fiancé for 2 minutes. I noticed." Clara set down her glass. "I am not a teacup." "No," Adrian said, looking only at her, "you're much more difficult to leave unattended." Lucas, who was not foolish, excused himself with the smoothness of a man backing away from live electricity. The second he was gone, Clara turned to Adrian. That was primitive. His gaze remained fixed on her face. "Probably. You do not get to arrive like a storm every time another man speaks to me. Then stop looking at them as if you're relieved they're easier than I am." The word struck. Not because they were fair, but because they were close enough to truth to hurt. "Easier is not a crime," she said quietly. "No," his jaw flexed. "But I have never once mistaken what happens when you look at me." Music drifted from the lawn. Somewhere behind them people laughed. The night smelled of roses and cut grass and heat settling into stone. Clara's heartbeat had become a problem. "This was supposed to be simple," she whispered. Adrian stepped closer. "It was never simple for me." She looked up sharply. He was too close now, close enough that every disciplined instinct in her seemed to split in two, one side urging retreat, the other exhausted by retreating. "You don't get to say things like that and then return to business in the morning." "What would you prefer I return to?" The question went through her like a lit match. "Adrian." He touched her then, one hand rising to her jaw with the careful certainty of a man who had denied himself too long to mistake hesitation for permission. Clara did not pull away. His thumb brushed just below her ear. Her breath left her. The world narrowed to his hand, his eyes, the unbearable fact that this was the first truly private touch he had allowed himself. "Kiss me," she said before pride could stop her. He did. Not gently. Not ruthlessly. Desperately controlled at first, then less so, as if every measured day between them had finally broken rank. Clara grasped his lapels to steady herself and felt the answering force of his hand at her waist, then her back, drawing her closer until there was no room left for caution and very little left for thought. When he lifted his mouth from hers, both of them were breathing like they had run somewhere dangerous. "This changes everything," she said. "Yes," Adrian answered, voice rough. "It does." Everything changed, and yet the week that followed demanded the performance continue. That was the cruelest part. After the kiss in Hampshire, they returned to London with the Trust still observing, the board still maneuvering, the press still circling, and no clean language for what now existed between them. Adrian became quieter in public, not colder but more careful, as though desire had made him protective of silence. In private the tension sharpened until every shared glance felt like an unfinished sentence. Clara might have endured that indefinitely if not for Celeste. The first sign came in the form of an article published online by a business columnist famous for flattering wealthy enemies into giving themselves away. Hotel heiress or hotel plant? The piece questioned Clara's qualifications, implied she had been selected for intimacy rather than expertise, and suggested Vale Hospitality's heritage preservation plan was merely romantic camouflage for asset manipulation. Buried halfway down was a line that made Clara's blood run cold. Anonymous internal sources indicate Miss Bennet's family property is expected to receive preferential rescue terms once the trust vote concludes. By noon every board member had seen it. By 1, 2 trustees had requested clarification. By 2, Clara stood in Adrian's office holding a printed copy with fingers that no longer felt entirely steady. The room was all glass, steel, and city sky, but she felt trapped inside it. "Did you know this was coming?" she asked. Adrian rose from behind his desk at once. "No. Don't lie to me. I'm not." "Then someone inside your company is feeding them details of my family finances and making me look like a mistress with a debt problem." His expression turned lethal in a way she had not yet seen directed inward. "Naomi is tracing the leak. That is not enough." Clara threw the paper onto his desk. "I will not stand in front of your board and let them think I slept my way into a strategy seat. No one who matters believes that." She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "That is such a man's answer." His jaw tightened. "Clara. No. You do not get to calm this into abstraction." She took a breath that hurt. "I had a name before I met you. I had competence before I met you. I agreed to help you because I needed money and because I believed I could do something useful, and now every parasite with a pen gets to turn me into a cautionary tale." Adrian came around the desk slowly. "Tell me what you need. I need to know whether this was ever survivable." The question stopped him. For one terrible second she saw the truth in his face before he answered, not certainty, but fear. Fear that the world he moved through so effectively had always been designed to devour women standing near men like him. Fear that he had brought her into it because he needed her and wanted her and had convinced himself those motives could coexist without cost. "That article came from Celeste's side," he said at last. "I can't prove it yet." "But you suspect it." "Yes. And you still let me stand in the same rooms with her smiling at me." His voice lowered. "If I could remove you from every cruel room, I would. That is not the point." "I know." Clara closed her eyes briefly. She was so tired. Tired of cameras, speculation, wealth, games, and the fact that none of it had managed to matter as much as the look on his face now. "I cannot do this if I become a weakness in your war." "You are not a weakness." "Then what am I?" He answered too fast. "Everything." Silence crashed between them. The word was too much. Too honest. Too late and too soon all at once. Clara stepped back. "Don't. Clara. Don't say things like that in the same breath as strategy. I can't tell where the contract ends anymore." His face changed then, not into anger but injury, swift and clean. "You think I can?" She hated that question because it exposed the exact shape of the problem. He had begun this. He had named the terms. He had offered money, proximity, purpose, and now something real had grown in the cracks between them, wild enough to make all the original architecture feel obscene. "I need distance," she said. Adrian's hands curled once at his sides and went still. "The trust votes in 9 days. Then find another way." When she turned to leave, he did not stop her. That hurt more than if he had. Clara packed that evening and returned to a small serviced flat Naomi helped arrange without asking questions. The ring remained on the table beside the bed all night, catching moonlight like an accusation. She should have removed it sooner. She could not. The next morning Theo called. She told him a version of the truth. "You like him," Theo said after a long silence. "That is not the issue." "It sounds exactly like the issue. He lives in a world where affection becomes leverage. And you don't." Clara stared out the flat's narrow window at the city. "Not like that." Theo was quiet for a beat. "Mum used to say that some people are born in storms and think calm is dishonesty." She almost smiled despite herself. "Whose side are you on?" "Yours. Which is why I'm saying this: if he let your family property die, I'd hate him for you. But if he tried to save it before you were useful, then maybe the worst thing about him isn't his power. Maybe it's that he's inconveniently sincere." Inconveniently sincere. Clara sat with that all day, trying not to think about the fact that Adrian had not called. By evening she realized that abstaining from contact might be the most respectful thing he had done yet. He was giving her what she asked for even if it cost him. At 9:30 there was a knock on her flat door. Naomi stood outside, immaculate as always, holding a folder. "The board has called an emergency session," she said. Celeste moved early. She wants the trust to reject the preservation plan and force liquidation of the boutique portfolio before the vote. Clara's stomach dropped. Can she do that? Only if Adrian loses control of the narrative tomorrow. Naomi held out the folder. "He asked me not to pressure you. He also asked me to make sure you had the evidence if you wanted it." Inside the folder were internal emails, timeline notes, and copies of Adrian's pre-contract orders regarding the Lantern House. The dates were all there. His intent was there. His defense of her was there. Quiet, documented, undeniable. At the bottom lay one handwritten note in his precise script. "You said once that companies call places home until a spreadsheet erases them. I am trying, belatedly and imperfectly, not to be that man." Clara did not sleep. By dawn she had reread every page in the folder, every timestamp, every approval, every piece of evidence Naomi had quietly assembled. Adrian had not merely planned to preserve the Lantern House. He had argued for broader heritage protections before she walked into his suite. He had been fighting a war she had mistaken for indifference because he fought it in the language available to him: documents, authorizations, delayed conversions, protected budgets, strategic silence. None of it erased the harm of the arrangement. None of it removed the ugliness of how she had been exposed. But it changed the center of him, and Clara could no longer pretend otherwise. The emergency board session began at 11 in Vale House, the corporate headquarters across from Green Park. Clara arrived 10 minutes early in a cream suit that felt like armor and carried Naomi's folder under her arm. The lobby was dense with press. Inside, security was tighter than usual. Celeste had overplayed her hand. People smelled blood. Naomi met Clara by the private lift. "He doesn't know you're here." "Good." The boardroom on the top floor was a study in controlled aggression: glass walls, dark wood, a table long enough to make intimacy impossible. Adrian stood at one end speaking quietly with Beatrice Harrington and two trustees when Clara entered. He turned at the movement near the door and went completely still. It was the first time she had ever seen him lose composure in public without any attempt to hide it. Celeste, seated halfway down the table in white silk and cool confidence, noticed at once. "Miss Bennet," she said smoothly. "How resilient." Clara took the empty chair beside Naomi and set the folder down. "I've been called worse." The meeting began badly and deteriorated fast. Celeste argued that Clara's presence represented a conflict, that the preservation plan had been tainted by personal influence, and that Adrian had blurred professional lines for private advantage. She spoke with the calm precision of a woman who believed poison worked best when poured slowly. Two board members shifted. One trustee frowned. Adrian remained standing, face unreadable, but Clara saw strain in the set of his shoulders. Celeste ended by recommending immediate suspension of the heritage proposal, removal of Clara from all consultancy review, and an independent audit of Adrian's conduct. When she sat, the room held its breath for one beat. Beatrice was the first to break the silence. She asked Clara whether she wished to respond as the accused consultant or as the woman whose name had been traded for sport. Clara rose slowly and opened Naomi's folder. She walked the board through Adrian's dated preservation directives, the deferred conversion order, the staffing protections, and the handwritten notes proving the Lantern House had been under consideration months before their arrangement began. Then she laid the article beside the documents and said the simplest thing in the room. If anyone questioned her integrity, they could read dates and face her directly. Celeste objected at once, but the room had turned. One director asked why anonymous briefing material matched language from Celeste's own expansion memo. Another asked why she had moved to liquidate Coastal Holdings before the trust vote unless confusion would benefit her. Adrian still had not spoken. Clara understood then that he was letting truth arrive without force, because force was what people expected from him. At last Beatrice asked one question: had he initiated the arrangement to manipulate the trust? Adrian met her gaze and answered, I initiated it to solve a problem. I stayed because I loved her. No one moved. The confession did not sound theatrical. It sounded expensive in a room where honesty was. Clara felt heat rush through her, not from embarrassment but from the relief of hearing the truth spoken at last. Celeste recovered and called the declaration manipulative, sentimental, convenient. Beatrice cut her off with a glance sharp enough to slice paper. Then, with gentleness, the woman informed the board that she trusted men less when they hid emotion than when they revealed it under risk. The audit would proceed regarding the leak. The preservation vote would proceed as scheduled. Clara would remain. The meeting adjourned into a storm of aides, lawyers, and reporters waiting outside the sealed doors. Adrian did not touch Clara as the room emptied. He simply stood near enough to ask, without asking, whether she wanted him close. She wanted 1,000 things at once, none of them easy. Beatrice paused beside her on the way out. You are not finished, the older woman said quietly. Neither is he. Then she left, trailing authority like perfume. Naomi intercepted 3 journalists with the calm of a battlefield surgeon, buying Clara and Adrian 30 rare seconds alone in the boardroom again. Adrian spoke first. He did not apologize for loving her, that would have cheapened it. He apologized for the cost of coming near him. Clara set the folder down and told him she had read every order, every note, every proof that the Lantern House had mattered before she did. His eyes closed briefly, as if relief itself could wound. I should have told you sooner, he said. Yes, she answered. You should have. Then she crossed the distance between them and pressed her palm to his chest, right over the furious steadiness of his heart. She had not left. He covered her hand with his own, turned his face into her palm for one unguarded second, and Clara felt the whole architecture of him shift beneath touch. When he kissed her this time, it was not stolen by heat or jealousy or distance. It was chosen. Quiet at first, then deeper, until the room, the scandal, and the waiting reporters dissolved into nothing but breath and certainty. When they finally broke apart, Naomi opened the door just enough to say the press statement was ready and the trustees were backing the plan. Adrian touched Clara's forehead, smiling at last. 3 days later the trust voted in a private chamber lined with portraits of dead benefactors who had probably never imagined their legacy would hinge on a storm, a leak, and a woman from a seaside inn. The preservation plan passed by a narrow but final margin. Coastal properties would remain under local identity protections. Conversion pressure was frozen. The Lantern House would receive restoration funding through a heritage partnership rather than a buyout. Celeste resigned before noon. By afternoon headlines shifted from scandal to strategy, though every version still put Adrian's name before Clara's, which he hated on sight. The contract was supposed to end that week. Clara signed the final consultancy papers in Naomi's office, accepted congratulations she barely heard, and stared at the termination date until the numbers blurred. The money would clear within 48 hours. The inn would survive. By every rational standard, she had won exactly what she came for. Yet victory felt strangely unfinished, as if the story had stopped at the point where a sensible woman should feel relief and instead found a cliff edge. That evening Adrian asked if she would walk with him on the hotel roof. She said yes. The roof garden was empty except for wind, low lights, and the restless shimmer of London below. Adrian stood very still beside the stone planter wall, one hand in his pocket, tie loosened, the city's reflected light cutting silver across his face. For the first time since she had met him, he looked like a man standing outside power rather than inside it. Not because he had lost any of it, but because tonight he was not wearing it as armor. "I've spent most of my life being useful," he said when she reached him. "Useful to the company. Useful to the board. Useful to a family that mistakes endurance for character. I was very good at becoming whatever stability looked like from a distance." He looked out over the city as if it were easier than looking at her. "Then you walked into my room angry, exhausted, and impossible, and suddenly usefulness felt like a poor substitute for being known." Clara said nothing at first. She let the word settle. Wind moved softly through the lavender planted along the roof edge. Somewhere below, sirens threaded through traffic. Above them, the sky held that peculiar late-evening blue that made London look briefly honest. "The contract ends tomorrow," she said at last. "Yes. And if I leave?" He turned then. Whatever answer he had prepared was not the one he gave. "Then I will make certain the Lantern House thrives, I will never use your name to buy my redemption, and I will spend an embarrassing amount of time resenting every corridor in this hotel." The laugh escaped her before she could stop it, and the relief that crossed his face at the sound was so unguarded it nearly undid her. That was almost charming. "I'm capable of progress under supervision." Clara stepped closer. "You do realize that this would be much easier if you were less sincere." "I know. That is infuriating." "I know that too." She searched his face, the face that had once seemed carved from glass and command, and saw now not fragility exactly, but exposure. Adrian had always been powerful. What shook her was that he had chosen, repeatedly and against every instinct he possessed, to set that power down in her presence when it mattered most. He had asked before touching. He had listened before defending. He had loved before being certain he would be loved back. For a man like him, that was not softness. It was courage. "I don't want the contract," Clara said quietly. His expression changed with almost painful restraint. "You don't?" "I want the consultancy, because I earned it." She took another step until only a breath remained between them. "I want the Lantern House protected because places like it deserve more than elegant extinction." Her voice softened. "And I want you to stop speaking as if I'm choosing between love and self-respect, because I'm not. I'm choosing whether you're capable of standing beside me when this becomes ordinary." Adrian's eyes closed for the briefest second, as if the word ordinary hit somewhere deeper than every declaration before it. "When this becomes ordinary," he said, voice low, "I'll still bring you breakfast when you forget to eat. I'll still argue with you about renovation budgets. I'll still look for you first in every room. If you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life learning how to deserve the ordinary parts." Something inside her, tight for weeks, finally gave way. "You make it very difficult to leave dramatically," Clara murmured. "I can try harder if you need theater." "I do not need theater." She lifted a hand to his face. "I need honesty. Then here is mine." He leaned into her touch, no performance left in him now at all. "I love you. Not because you changed my image. Not because you challenged me, though you do. Not because loving you makes me better, though it has. I love you because every time you walk into a room, I want to become the kind of man who is worthy of your staying." This time when she kissed him, it felt less like collision and more like arrival. Slow, certain, warm with everything that no longer needed to be hidden. His hands came to her waist and held her there as if the whole city could turn to noise beneath them and it would not matter. When they parted, their foreheads rested together. "So," he said after a moment, "is this where I ask whether you'll stay in London?" Clara smiled. "No." His brows lifted. "This is where I tell you that if you want me, you'll spend half your week in London and half of it at a windswept inn on the coast where the shower in room 4 only behaves if threatened properly and Theo will judge your coffee standards." A pause. Then, with complete seriousness, "That sounds manageable. You have not met Theo in a foul mood. I've survived board rebellions. You say that now." He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and the sight of it nearly stopped her heart. She had seen fragments before. Brief, private, reluctant versions. Nothing like this. Not the expression of a conqueror. The expression of a man unexpectedly given a home he had not known how to ask for. The next month passed in motion. There were papers to finalize, staff structures to revise, and an ocean of press to outlast. Adrian took the consultancy scandal and turned it into policy, establishing independent review protections so no future hire could be slandered into silence by board politics. Naomi accepted Clara's flowers with suspicious grace and later admitted the office had become marginally more human since Adrian began losing arguments at a reasonable volume. Theo met Adrian at the Lantern House with folded arms and deep suspicion, which lasted exactly 7 minutes, until Adrian climbed onto the leaking kitchen stool without being asked and helped repair a shelf Theo had been cursing since March. Summer turned the cliff path gold. Guests returned. The breakfast room filled. The roof was repaired. The old sign outside was restored rather than replaced, its paint imperfect in the exact way memory required. Adrian came down every Friday night when he could, always later than promised, always carrying too much work, and somehow always leaving it untouched by Saturday morning because Clara would drag him onto the headland before sunrise and remind him that silence could be generous when no one was using it as punishment. By autumn, the inn had become a running joke in business profiles about the Vale chief executive's unusual attachment to coastal weather, though those pieces never captured the truth of it. The truth was simpler. Adrian belonged nowhere gracefully except where Clara was. He learned to stack breakfast plates, to answer guests who cornered him about local walks, to tolerate Theo's insults regarding city shoes. Clara learned that he slept best when there was wind at the windows and no one asking him to be invulnerable by morning. One evening in October, after the last dinner service had ended and the sea was loud in the dark beyond the glass, Clara found him in the empty lounge lighting the fire. He looked up as she entered, jacket off, sleeves rolled, hair undone by salt air, and smiled that private smile that still felt like winning something sacred. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him from behind. "I was just thinking that for a man who once tried to solve everything with a contract, you've become suspiciously domestic." He covered her hands with his. "You say that like it's criticism. It might be admiration in disguise." He turned within her arms and drew her close. Firelight moved across the room, warm and steady. Beyond the windows the dark sea kept striking the cliff below, tireless as ever, but inside the inn there was only lamplight, wood smoke, and the unmistakable peace of two people who had fought their way out of performance and into something real enough to keep. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him gently, with the ease of repetition and the wonder of never quite getting used to it. When she pulled back, Adrian rested his forehead against hers and smiled the way he only did here, not like a powerful man, not like a feared one, but like someone who had finally stopped mistaking control for safety. Outside, the wind moved over the headland and the inn held fast against it, lit from within.